Page 4 of 8, reading the PDF on the CIA.gov website about MKUltra. Revelation. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Pursuant to this order, most CIA documents regarding the project were destroyed, making a full investigation of MKUltra impossible. In December 1974, the New York Times reported that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities, including experiments on U.S. citizens. During the 1960s, that report prompted investigations by the U.S. Congress in the form of the Church Committee and by a presidential commission known as Rockefeller Commission that looked into domestic activities of the CIA, the FBI, and intelligence-related agencies of the military. In the summer of 1975, Congressional Church Committee reports and the Presidential Rockefeller Commission report revealed to the public for the first time that the CIA and the Department of Defense had conducted experiments on both unwitting and cognizant human subjects as part of an extensive program to influence and control human behavior through the use of psychoactive drugs such as LSD and mescaline and other chemical, biological, and psychological means. They also revealed that at least one subject had died after administration of LSD. Much of what the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission learned about MKUltra was contained in a report prepared by the Inspector General's office in 1963. That had survived the destruction of records ordered in 1973. However, it contained little detail. The Congressional Committee investigating the CIA research, chaired by Senator Frank Church, concluded that prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. The committee noted that the experiments sponsored by these researchers call into question the decision by the agencies not to fix guidelines for experiments. Following the recommendations of the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford in 1976 issued the first executive order on intelligence activities, which, among other things, prohibited experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with the informed consent, in writing, and witnessed by a disinterested party of each such human subject. In accordance with the guidelines issued by the National Commission, subsequent orders by President Carter and Reagan expanded the directive to apply to any human experimentation. On the heels of the revelations about CIA experiments, similar stories surfaced regarding U.S. Army experiments in 1975. In 1975, the Secretary of the Army instructed the Army Inspector General to conduct an investigation. Among the findings of the Inspector General was the existence of a 1953 memorandum penned by then Secretary of Defense Charles Irwin Wilson. Documents show that the CIA participated in at least two of Department of Defense committees during 1952. These committees' findings led to the issuance of the Wilson Memo, which mandated, in according with the Nuremberg Code protocols, that only volunteers be used for experimental operations conducted in the U.S. Armed Forces. In response to the Inspector General's investigation, the Wilson Memo was declassified in August 1975. With regard to drug testing within the Army, the Inspector General found that the evidence clearly reflected that every possible medical consideration was observed by the professional investigators at the medical research laboratories. However, the Inspector General also found that the mandated requirements of Wilson's 1953 memorandum had been only partially adhered to. He concluded that the volunteers were not fully informed as required prior to their participation, and the methods of procuring their search services in many cases appeared not to have been in accord with the intent of Department of the Army policies governing use of volunteers in research. Other branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, the Air Force for example, were found not to have adhered to Wilson Memo stipulations regarding voluntary drug testing. In 1977, during a hearing held by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to look further into MKUltra, Admiral Stansfield Turner, the director of Central Intelligence, revealed that the CIA had found a set of records consisting of about 20,000 pages that had survived the 1973 destruction orders. Due to having been stored at a records center not usually used for such documents, these files dealt with the financing of MKUltra projects and as such contained few details of those projects, but much more was learned from them than the Inspector General's 1963 report. In Canada, the issue took much longer to surface, becoming widely known in 1984 on a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation news show, The Fifth Estate. It was learned that not only had the CIA funded Dr. Cameron's efforts, but perhaps even more shockingly, the Canadian government was full aware of this and had later provided another $500,000 in funding to continue the experiments. This revelation largely derailed efforts by the victims to sue the CIA as their U.S. counterparts had, and the Canadian government eventually settled out of court for $100,000 to each of the 127 victims. None of Dr. Cameron's personal records of his involvement with MKUltra survive, since his family destroyed them after his death from a heart attack while mountain climbing in 1967. U.S. General Accounting Office report. The U.S. General Accounting Office issued a report on September 28, 1994, which stated that between 1940 and 1974, DoD and other national security agencies studied thousands of human subjects in tests and experiments involving hazardous substance. The quote from the study: "Working with the CIA, the Department of Defense gave hallucinogenic drugs to thousands of volunteer soldiers in the 1950s and 1960s. In addition to LSD, the Army also tested quinquidinol, benzylate, and a hallucinogen codenamed BZ. Many of the tests were conducted under the so-called MKUltra program, established to counter perceived Soviet and Chinese advances in brainwashing techniques. Between 1953 and 1964, the program consisted of 149 projects involving drug testing and other studies on unwitting human subjects. Legal issues involving informed consent. The revelations about the CIA and the Army prompted a number of subjects or their survivors to file lawsuits against the federal government for conducting illegal experiments. Although the government aggressively and sometimes successfully sought to avoid legal liability, several plaintiffs did receive compensation through court order, out-of-court settlement, or acts of Congress. Frank Olson's family received $750,000 by a special act of Congress, and both President Ford and CIA Director William Colby met with Olson's family to publicly apologize. Previously, the CIA and the Army had actively and successfully sought to withhold incriminating information, even as they secretly provided compensation to the families. One subject of Army drug experimentation, James Stanley, an Army sergeant, brought an important, albeit unsuccessful, suit. The government argued that Stanley was barred from suing under a legal doctrine known as the Ferris Doctrine. After a 1950 Supreme Court case, Ferris versus United States, that prohibits members of the armed forces from suing the government for any harms that were inflicted incident to service. In 1987, the Supreme Court affirmed this defense in a 5-4 decision that dismissed Stanley's case.